The wind howled across the Montana plains on that bitter December morning in 1876. Snow crunched beneath the boots of soldiers as they approached what would become one of America's most horrific and forgotten war crimes. What you're about to hear isn't just another story from the Old West, it's a tale of vengeance, blood, and the darkest chapter in the aftermath of Custer's last stand. Lieutenant James Calhoun wasn't just any cavalry officer. He was General George Armstrong, Custer's own nephew, carrying the weight of his uncle's death at Little Bighorn like a burning coal in his chest. And on this day, that coal would ignite into an inferno that would consume innocent lives and stain American history forever. But before we dive into the heart of this tragedy, let me tell you something that will shock you. This story has been buried, hidden, and scrubbed from most history books for nearly 150 years. The US military, the government, even historians have conspired to keep this massacre in the shadows. Why? Because what happened in that remote valley near Yellowstone reveals the true, savage nature of America's westward expansion. If this story grips you the way it should, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're about to uncover truths that powerful people never wanted you to know. The blood debt 6 months earlier. The world had watched in horror as news spread of Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn, the golden boy of the American cavalry, the man who styled himself as the savior of the frontier, had been utterly destroyed by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. His entire 7th Cavalry Regiment, 268 men wiped from existence in a single afternoon of brutal combat. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Custer's family took it personally, very personally. James Calhoun had grown up idolizing his Uncle George. He'd followed him through the Civil War, through the Indian campaigns, through every bloody mile of the Army's march west. When news reached him that his uncle's scalped corpse had been found among the dead at Little Bighorn, something snapped inside the young lieutenant's mind. The official records state that Calhoun was temporarily unfit for duty due to emotional distress. But the reality was far worse. Fellow officers reported that he would pace his tent at night, muttering about revenge, about making the Lakota pay in blood for what they had done to his family. The army should have relieved him of command. They should have sent him home to grieve. Instead, they gave him exactly what he wanted, a chance for payback. The hunt. GNS General Nelson Miles, commanding the Department of the Missouri, was under intense pressure from Washington to pacify the remaining hostile tribes. The defeat at Little Bighorn had embarrassed the entire military establishment, and President Grant himself was demanding swift and decisive action. Miles knew that Calhoun was unstable, but he also knew the young lieutenant's thirst for vengeance could be useful. In December 1876, he assigned Calhoun to lead a winter patrol in the Yellowstone region, ostensibly to locate and monitor Lakota winter camps. But Calhoun had other plans. He handpicked his men carefully, not the professional soldiers who might question orders, but the dregs of frontier military service, men with criminal backgrounds, soldiers facing court-martial, drifters who had joined the army to escape their pasts. These weren't men who would hesitate when the time came to cross lines that should never be crossed. The patrol consisted of 43 men, officially designated as Company K Detachment. In reality, they were a death squad with military uniforms. As they rode north toward the Yellowstone River, Calhoun made his intentions clear to his hand-picked killers. "We're not just hunting Indians," he told them around the campfire on their 3rd night out. "We're hunting the ones who murdered my uncle. And when we find them, we're going to make them scream." The innocent Siamp. What Calhoun didn't care to know was that the band of Lakota they would eventually encounter had nothing to do with the Battle of Little Bighorn. These were peaceful Indians, members of Spotted Eagle's small band, who had been trying to make their way to the reservation when winter caught them in a remote valley along the Yellowstone. The camp consisted of just 17 lodges, about 60 people total. Most were women, children, and elderly men. The young warriors who might have defended them had left weeks earlier to hunt buffalo, trying to gather enough meat to survive the harsh winter. Spotted Eagle himself was nearly 70 years old, a chief who had spent the last decade trying to negotiate peace between his people and the white settlers. He had never raised a weapon against American soldiers. He had signed every treaty the government had put in front of him. None of that would matter. The women in the camp were going about their daily routines on that December morning, making repairs to their lodges, tending to children, preparing what little food they had. 31 Lakota women whose names had been lost to history, whose voices were silenced before they could tell their own stories. They had no idea that death was riding toward them across the snow-covered plains. This is the moment where everything changes, where a family feud becomes a war crime. If you're not subscribed yet, you need to be, because what comes next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about American history. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what you think so far. The APP, or Osage Calhoun scouts, spotted the smoke from the Lakota fires on December 23, 1876. It was 2 days before Christmas, a detail that would later add bitter irony to the official reports. The lieutenant called his men together as the sun set behind the mountains. In the flickering light of their own campfire, his face looked like something carved from stone. The other officers in the detachment, Lieutenant William Morris and Second Lieutenant Thomas McDougal, would later testified that Calhoun's eyes had taken on an almost supernatural intensity. "Tomorrow, we settle accounts," he announced. "My uncle's death cries out for justice, and by God, we're going to give it to him." But this wasn't going to be justice. What Calhoun outlined to his men was something else entirely. The plan was simple and brutal. They would surround the camp at dawn, when most of the inhabitants would still be asleep. Any men of fighting age would be shot on sight. The women and children would be dealt with separately. Lieutenant Morris, one of the few professional soldiers in the group, raised an objection. "Sir, with respect, our orders are to locate hostile camps and report their positions. We're not authorized to engage without..." Calhoun cut him off with a gesture that made several of the enlisted men reach for their weapons. "Our orders," he said quietly, "come from a higher authority than General Miles. They come from the blood of every soldier who died at Little Bighorn. They come from my uncle's ghost, crying out from the grave for vengeance." Morris fell silent. He would later claim in his testimony that he feared for his own life if he continued to resist. The men spent the evening checking their weapons, sharpening their knives, and preparing for what many of them seemed to understand would be less a battle than a slaughter. As they settled in for the night, Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, a brutal Irish immigrant who had served with distinction in the Civil War, made a suggestion that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. "Lieutenant," he said, "if we're going to send a message to the hostiles, it needs to be one they'll never forget. Bullets are too quick, too clean. We need to make them suffer the way General Custer suffered." Calhoun's response would later be recorded in multiple testimonies. "Sergeant O'Malley, you may be the smartest man in this detachment." The dawn ATTA Secretary attack began at first light on December 24th. Calhoun had positioned his men around the small valley, cutting off any possibility of escape. The plan was executed with military precision and civilian brutality. The first shots shattered the peaceful morning silence. 3 elderly Lakota men, emerging from their lodges to investigate the sound of horses approaching, were cut down before they could even call out a warning. But it was what happened next that transformed this from a military action into a war crime. Instead of accepting the surrender of the women and children, who immediately emerged from their lodges with their hands raised, some carrying white cloth, Calhoun ordered his men to herd them into the center of the camp. 31 women, ranging in age from teenagers to grandmothers, 17 children, the youngest barely 2 years old. Lieutenant Morris Dees, watching from his position on the ridge, would later testify that he could hear Calhoun shouting orders, but the words were lost in the wind. What he could see, however, was his commanding officer pointing at the largest lodge in the center of the camp and making gestures that filled Maurice with dread. The women were forced into that lodge at gunpoint. The children were separated. The boys over 12 were shot immediately, while the younger children were forced to watch as soldiers began piling firewood and brush around the lodge. That's when the screaming began. The Bureninjua happened next defies human understanding. It challenges everything we want to believe about civilization, about the rules of war, about basic human decency. Sergeant O'Malley, acting on Calhoun's direct orders, set the lodge on fire with the women still inside. But here's the detail that makes this story even more horrific. They didn't burn quickly. The lodge was made of buffalo hide, treated with fat and oils. It burned slowly, producing thick, black smoke and intense heat that tortured the women inside for nearly 30 minutes. The soldiers formed a circle around the burning lodge, their rifles trained on the smoke-filled doorway. Any woman who tried to escape the flames was shot and thrown back into the fire. The screaming that morning must have echoed across those mountains like the voices of the damned. Private Samuel Harrison, one of the few men in the detachment who retained any semblance of conscience, would later write in his diary, "I have seen men die in battle. I have seen the worst that war can offer, but I have never heard sounds like the ones that came from that lodge." They were not human sounds. They were the sounds of souls being torn from bodies. Lieutenant Morris, unable to watch any longer, spurred his horse down from the ridge and rode toward the camp, intending to put a stop to the madness. But Calhoun intercepted him before he could reach the burning lodge. "Stay back, Lieutenant," Calhoun ordered, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos around them. "This is necessary. This is what justice looks like." "This isn't justice," Morris shouted back. "This is murder." "This is..." Calhoun drew his sidearm and pointed it at Morris's chest. "This is what happens to anyone who betrays my uncle's memory. Get back to your position now." Morris retreated, but not before he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Calhoun was smiling. The man was actually smiling as he watched 31 innocent women burn alive. "If you're still with me, you understand now why this story has been buried. This isn't just history, this is a glimpse into the absolute darkest corners of the human soul." Subscribe and comment below if you think stories like this should be told, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. The aftermath. By noon on Christmas Eve, 1876, the massacre was complete. 31 Lakota women were dead, burned alive in one of the most horrific war crimes ever committed on American soil. 17 children had been murdered. The 3 elderly men who had tried to protect them lay scalped and mutilated among the ashes. But Calhoun wasn't finished. He ordered his men to burn the entire camp, every lodge, every piece of clothing, every scrap of food that might have helped other Lakota survive the winter. The bodies of the women were left in the charred remains of the lodge, while the men and children were left unburied for the wolves. Then came the most chilling order of all. Anyone who speaks of what happened here will be shot for treason. The official report filed by Lieutenant Calhoun stated that Company K detachment had encountered a hostile war party of approximately 50 Lakota warriors and defeated them after fierce resistance. According to his fabricated account, his men had suffered no casualties while inflicting significant losses on the enemy force. No mention of women, no mention of children, no mention of the lodge that had become a crematorium. For nearly a month, it appeared that Calhoun's secret would remain buried with his victims. But then conscience began to eat away at some of his men. Private Harrison, the young soldier who had written about the screaming in his diary, began drinking heavily. He started talking in saloons, telling fragmented stories about something terrible that had happened during their winter patrol. Lieutenant Morris, consumed by guilt, requested an immediate transfer to a different regiment. When pressed by his new commanding officer about his reasons, he broke down and revealed the truth about the massacre. Sergeant O'Malley, the man who had actually lit the fire, began suffering from what we would now recognize as severe stress disorder. He was found dead in his barracks 3 months later, apparently having taken his own life. His suicide note contained just 4 words: "The screaming never stops." The cover-up one word of the massacre finally reached General Miles in January 1877. His reaction was swift and decisive, not to seek justice, but to contain the scandal. Miles understood immediately that if news of the atrocity became public, it would destroy the Army's reputation and potentially end his own career. The military was already under intense scrutiny following Custer's defeat. A story about American soldiers burning women alive would be the final nail in the coffin of public support for the Indian campaigns. Rather than ordering a court-martial, Miles initiated what can only be described as an elaborate cover-up. First, he had Private Harrison arrested on charges of desertion and confined to a military prison where he could not speak to reporters or investigators. Harrison would die in custody 6 months later under mysterious circumstances, officially from pneumonia, though fellow prisoners reported that he had been badly beaten shortly before his death. Second, he transferred Lieutenant Morris to a remote posting in Alaska, effectively silencing him through isolation. Morris would never again speak publicly about what he had witnessed, though he would write detailed letters to his sister describing the massacre. Those letters wouldn't be discovered until after his death in 1903. Third, and most crucially, he promoted James Calhoun. That's right, the man who had orchestrated one of the worst war crimes in American history was rewarded with a promotion to captain and given command of a prestigious posting at Fort Leavenworth. The message was clear: the Army would protect those who got results, no matter how those results were achieved. The truth emerges. For decades, the savage massacre remained buried in classified military files. The few historians who stumbled across references to irregularities in Company K detachments, winter patrol, were either bought off or intimidated into silence. But secrets this dark have a way of surfacing eventually. In 1924, a researcher named Dr. Margaret Whitman was investigating Lakota oral histories when she encountered elderly tribal members who spoke of a Burning Lodge massacre that had occurred in the winter following Little Bighorn. The details they provided were so horrific that Whitman initially dismissed them as exaggerated folklore. But then she discovered Harrison's diary in an estate sale in Kansas. The diary, which had somehow survived despite the military's efforts to destroy all evidence of the massacre, provided corroborating details that matched the Lakota accounts with terrifying precision. Whitman spent the next 3 years tracking down additional evidence, including Maurice's letters to his sister and testimony from soldiers who had served alongside O'Malley. Her findings were published in 1927 in a small academic journal. But the article was quickly suppressed. The War Department claimed that the documents were forgeries and threatened Whitman with prosecution if she continued her research. She was forced to abandon her investigation, but not before she had hidden copies of all her evidence in a safe deposit box in Denver. Those documents wouldn't see daylight again until 1976, when Whitman's granddaughter discovered them while settling her estate. The pattern, Aravius, more evidence of the savage massacre, emerged throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Historians began to realize that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic pattern of atrocities committed by the US military during the Indian Wars. The burning of women and children alive wasn't unique to Calhoun's detachment. Similar incidents had occurred at Sand Creek in Colorado, at Wounded Knee in South Dakota, and at dozens of other locations across the American West. But the savage massacre was different in one crucial respect. It was motivated purely by personal revenge rather than military objectives. Calhoun wasn't trying to secure territory or protect settlers. He was trying to satisfy his own bloodlust, to somehow balance the cosmic scales after his uncle's death at Little Bighorn. The fact that the women he murdered had nothing to do with that battle didn't matter to him. In his twisted mind, all Lakota were guilty of his uncle's death, and all deserved to suffer. This is the point where we have to ask ourselves some hard questions. How many other massacres have been covered up? How many other war crimes have been buried in classified files? If you're ready to keep digging for these buried truths, subscribe now and let me know in the comments what other dark chapters of history you want me to investigate. The Lakota survived eras while the military was busy covering up their crime. The few Lakota who had witnessed the massacre were dealing with trauma that would echo through generations. Spotted Eagle, the elderly chief, had managed to escape into the wilderness when the attack began. He spent 3 days hiding in a cave, listening to the screams of his people echoing across the valley. When he finally emerged, he found a scene that defied description. The charred remains of the lodge still smoldered in the center of what had been his peaceful camp. The bodies of the children lay scattered in the snow, their small forms already being covered by fresh snowfall. Spotted Eagle would live for another 20 years, but those who knew him said he was never the same after that December morning. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was often to whisper the names of the women who had died in the burning lodge. The Lakota oral tradition preserved every detail of the massacre, passing the story from generation to generation with the careful precision that comes from knowing that no one else will remember the victims. They spoke of how Morningstar, a young mother, had tried to shield her infant daughter with her own body as the flames consumed them both. They remembered Winter Moon, an elderly grandmother who had sung traditional death songs even as the fire reached her. These women weren't just statistics in a military report. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, grandmothers. They had names, dreams, families. They had lived full lives before James. Calhoun decided that his personal vendetta was worth more than their existence. Calhoun's later life. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire story is what happened to James Calhoun after the massacre. He not only escaped punishment, he thrived. His promotion to captain was just the beginning. Over the next decade, he rose steadily through the ranks, eventually achieving the rank of colonel. He became known as one of the Army's most effective Indian fighters, leading campaigns across the West that resulted in the deaths of hundreds more Native Americans. The military establishment that had covered up his war crime now held him up. As a model officer, he was featured in newspaper articles as a hero of the frontier, a man who had avenged Custer's death and brought justice to the lawless West. Calhoun married well, to the daughter of a prominent Eastern industrialist. He had 4 children and lived in a mansion in Washington, D.C., where he hosted elaborate dinner parties for politicians and military leaders. By all external measures, He was successful, respected, admired. But those who knew him intimately told a different story. His wife would later write in her memoirs that her husband was plagued by nightmares throughout their marriage. He would wake in the middle of the night, screaming about fires and burning women. She often found him standing at their bedroom window in the early morning hours, staring out at nothing and muttering names she didn't recognize. His eldest son, James Calhoun Jr., would later tell researchers that his father had a peculiar obsession with fire. He couldn't tolerate having candles or lanterns lit in the house, and he flew into violent rages whenever anyone mentioned campfires or cooking fires. The man who had burned 31 women alive spent the rest of his life terrified of flames. Calhoun died in 1912, officially of a heart attack, but his personal physician confided to colleagues that the colonel had been found in his study, clutching a loaded revolver and muttering about making the screaming stop. Even in death, James Calhoun couldn't escape what he had done on that December morning in 1876. The broader CONSPIRAS researchers have dug deeper into the savage massacre. They've uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reaches far beyond the military. Government officials at the highest levels were aware of the atrocity and actively participated in covering it up. Interior Department records showed that Indian agents were instructed to report that the victims of the massacre had died from exposure and disease, rather than violence. Railroad companies, eager to continue their westward expansion without interference from hostile Indians, provided funding for the cover-up and used their political influence to suppress news coverage. Even churches got involved, with several prominent ministers preaching sermons that justified the massacre as God's judgment on the heathen savages. The conspiracy to hide the truth about the savage massacre involved dozens of people across multiple institutions, all united by their shared interests in continuing the violent dispossession of Native American lands. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the evidence that similar massacres were not only covered up, but actively encouraged as a matter of policy. Military correspondence from the period shows that officers were given broad discretion to use whatever methods necessary to pacify hostile tribes. The burning alive of women and children wasn't a violation of policy, it was policy, just never officially acknowledged as such. The modern RECKONN today, nearly 150 years after the savage massacre, we're finally beginning to confront the full scope of what happened during America's westward expansion. The site of the massacre, now located within Yellowstone National Park, has no official marker or memorial. Park rangers are instructed not to discuss the incident with visitors, and most tourists who hike through the area have no idea they're walking through what was once a crematorium. But Native American activists have been working to change that. In 2019, the Lakota Nation formally petitioned the National Park Service to install a memorial at the massacre site. The petition, signed by over 10,000 people, called for official recognition of the atrocity and a formal apology from the U.S. government. The Park Service's response was telling. They claimed that there was insufficient historical evidence to confirm that the massacre had occurred. This despite the overwhelming documentation that researchers had uncovered over the previous century. The refusal to acknowledge the savage massacre reveals something deeply troubling about how America continues to deal with its past. We're willing to memorialize the victories and noble struggles of our history, but we remain committed to burying the war crimes and genocidal campaigns that made those victories possible. We're nearing the end of this journey through one of America's darkest chapters. If this story has affected you the way it should, if it's made you think differently about our history and the stories we choose to tell ourselves, then subscribe and share this video. The only way these buried truths see daylight is if people like you refuse to let them stay buried. The unlearned LSSONS. What makes the savage massacre particularly relevant today is not just its historical significance, but what it reveals about the capacity for evil that exists within all of us when we allow personal grievances to override our basic humanity. James Calhoun wasn't a monster when he started his military career. By all accounts, he was a competent, even admirable young officer. But grief, rage, and a thirst for revenge transformed him into something truly monstrous. The soldiers who followed his orders weren't born killers. They were ordinary men who allowed themselves to be convinced that their victims were somehow less than human, that their suffering was somehow justified. The officials who covered up the massacre weren't cartoon villains. They were pragmatic bureaucrats who convinced themselves that protecting the institution was more important than seeking justice for the victims. These are the same psychological mechanisms that enable atrocities in every era. in every society. The same rationalizations, the same moral compromises, the same willingness to sacrifice the innocent for the sake of the powerful. The savage massacre is a mirror that reflects our own capacity for evil back at us, and what we see in that mirror should terrify us. The continuing saliency, perhaps the most depressing aspect of researching this story, has been discovering how many people know about the savage massacre, but choose to remain silent about it. Academic historians who have encountered references to the atrocity in their research often choose to focus on other topics rather than confront such disturbing material. Military historians, in particular, seem reluctant to acknowledge events that might tarnish the reputation of the armed forces. Government officials continue to classify documents related to the massacre and other similar atrocities, claiming that their release would somehow compromise national security. Even many Native American activists have been reluctant to publicize the story, fearing that it's so extreme that people won't believe it actually happened. This conspiracy of silence has allowed the savage massacre to remain buried for nearly 150 years. It's allowed James Calhoun to be remembered as a hero rather than a war criminal. It's allowed the victims to be forgotten, their names erased from history, their suffering denied. But silence in the face of atrocity is complicity. Every person who knows this story and chooses not to tell it is participating in the cover-up that began on that December morning in 1876, breaking the seal in Ciudades. Why videos like this one are so important. That's why we have to keep digging, keep investigating, keep refusing to accept the sanitized versions of history that powerful institutions want us to believe. The 31 women who died in that burning lodge deserve to have their story told. They deserve to be remembered not as anonymous casualties of manifest destiny, but as human beings who suffered and died for no reason other than one man's twisted need for revenge. Spotted Deagle and the other survivors deserve to have their testimony acknowledged rather than dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. The soldiers who tried to resist Calhoun's orders deserve to be remembered for their moral courage, even though it ultimately cost them their lives or their freedom. And we, the living, deserve to know the truth about our past, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. Because until we confront the reality of what was done in our name, until we acknowledge the full scope of the violence that built this nation, we can never truly move forward. The ghosts of those burning women are still with us. Their screams still echo across the Montana plains. Their suffering still demands justice, and until we provide that justice, until we remember them, honor them, and acknowledge what was done to them, we remain complicit in their murder. This is where I need you to take action. This story can't stay buried if people like you refuse to let it be buried. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with everyone you know. Comment below with your thoughts, your reactions, your commitment to keeping these stories alive, because the moment we stop telling these stories is the moment we allow them to happen again. The savage massacre of 1876 wasn't just a historical atrocity, it was a warning. A warning about what happens when we allow grief to become hatred, when we permit institutions to hide their crimes, when we choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. That warning is as relevant today as it was 150 years ago. The question is, are we finally ready to listen? The women who burned alive in that Yellowstone valley can't speak for themselves anymore, but their story can still be told. Their memory can still be honored. Their sacrifice can still serve as a reminder of our capacity for both evil and redemption. The choice is ours. The silence can continue, or it can end here, with you, with this moment, with your decision to refuse to let these voices be silenced forever. What will you choose? The research for this documentary was compiled from military records, survivor testimonies, personal diaries, and oral histories. While the U.S. government continues to classify many documents related to the savage massacre, enough evidence has emerged over the past century to establish the basic facts of this atrocity. The names of the victims have been lost to history, but their suffering must not be forgotten.